The discrepancy of Zechariah and the code of the Gospels, the historical anomaly. In Matthew 23:35 and Luke 11:51, Jesus mentions the killing of Zechariah to close the loop from the blood of Abel to the last prophet. However, a textual contradiction arises. Matthew calls him son of Barachiah, a name that corresponds to the post-exilic prophet, of whom there is no news of a killing in the temple. The royal story, the killing between the temple and the altar, fits perfectly with Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, a priest killed by order of King Joash, 2 Chronicles 24:20-22. The key to reading, Matthew verse Luke. This discrepancy is not an error, but a code intended to differentiate the two projects. Matthew, round-trip project, he intentionally inserts son of Barachiah to indicate the return of the project to the Old Testament and recall the patriarchal concept. He specifies the killing between the temple and the altar. Luke, return and fulfillment project. He omits his father's name altogether and changes the position between the altar and the sanctuary. Being the gospel of fulfillment, it uses a more sober tone, since it does not need to force the return to the Old Testament. In fact, the difference between the temple and the altar, and between the altar and the sanctuary, is that the altar is the place of external sacrifices. The killing of an animal represents the outward project. The sanctuary, on the other hand, represents the internal project. In fact, the difference between the temple and the altar, and between the altar and the sanctuary, is that the altar is the place of external sacrifices. The killing of an animal represents the outward project, with the return still pending. The sanctuary, on the other hand, represents the internal and return project, that is, the fulfillment. In fact, sanctuary from holy means separate, and indicates the project of return corresponding to the degenerative project of God Satan for the system of mind control and the falsification of the perception of reality. The symbolism of Zechariah and the return to Abel. The name Zechariah means memory of Yahweh and indicates a recall to the heart, to be understood not as mental memory, but as a real return. The heart symbolizes the project of return or the change of consciousness induced by God Satan. The cycle, the biblical arc from Abel to Zechariah, symbolically represents the return to the first creation of the Old Testament. The heart is in contrast to the circumcision according to the flesh of the outward project. The killing, it does not indicate a physical death, since this story never existed, but it represents the change of consciousness, is the mind control system induced by God Satan.